In the frozen twilight of 1984, in a concrete bunker buried deep in the snow-dusted forests of East Germany, Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Ogarkov was staring at a ghost. His world was a circle of green phosphorescence. He was an operator in the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, the vast, multi-trillion ruble shield designed to protect the motherland from the sky. His station was a P-18 spoon-rest early warning radar. It was crude, powerful, analog technology, a sledgehammer in a digital age, but it was reliable. It pumped massive waves of VHF energy into the black sky over the Fulda Gap, and it always found what was there. 52 seconds were slow-moving mountains on his screen. The terrifying Mach 3 Steradian 7-1 Blackbird was a blindingly fast streak. Even the new American F-15 seconds and F-16 seconds had signatures, patterns he had memorized, rhythms he could feel in his bones. This was nothing. It was not a blip. It was a flicker. A patch of static on his screen, just west of the border, that seemed to drink the radar's energy. It appeared for 3 sweeps, a smear of impossible data, and then it vanished. Not like a fast-moving jet exiting his sector, but like a light bulb being switched off. Dmitry checked his instruments. Power was stable. The vacuum tubes were warm and functioning. He tapped the glass. The ghost was gone. He leaned back, the rough wool of his uniform scratching his neck, and felt a cold drop of sweat trace a path down his spine. He had 2 choices. He could report an anomaly, a glitch, and invite the endless, suspicious paperwork of the politruk, the political officer, who would see equipment failure as a failure of ideological commitment. Or he could report nothing. He could assume it was a flock of birds or a pocket of charged atmosphere. He picked up the logbook. 2240. Sector 12. Atmospheric interference. He signed his name. But 2 nights later, it happened again. And the week after that, a different station, 60 kilometers to the south, reported the same atmospheric interference. Then a station in Czechoslovakia, then a high-altitude MiG-25 Foxbat scrambled to intercept a Phantom, found nothing on its powerful Smerch-A radar. The pilot, a hero of the Soviet Union, landed his massive fuel-guzzling interceptor and furiously reported that his instruments were clean, his eyes were clear, and there was nothing there. These reports, these whispers of glitches and phantoms began their slow bureaucratic climb. From operators like Dmitry, to their station chiefs, to the regional command, until they finally landed, bound in a thin red folder, on a vast oak desk in Moscow. The desk belonged to a general of the PVO. He read the file, a summary of a dozen impossible events, and his blood ran cold. He was not looking at a collection of isolated glitches. He was looking at a pattern. This was not a flaw in their machines. Their machines were working perfectly. The flaw, the terrifying, gaping, existential flaw, was in their understanding of reality. The Americans, their sworn enemy, were apparently operating something over the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. And they were doing it whenever they pleased. And the PVO, the vaunted shield of the socialist world, could not see it. This is a story not of a single weapon, but of a dawning, paralegent horror. A mystery that, for the Soviet Union, began not with a bang, but with a whisper, a flicker on a green screen that suggested their entire defense doctrine was a lie. They were staring into an abyss, and the abyss was staring back, unseen. We explore the secret histories and impossible technologies that defined the Cold War. These are the stories that were hidden, buried in classified files, and are only now coming to light. If you want to understand the real impact of these ghost projects, subscribe to Cold War Impact. This phantom in the machine was more than an intelligence failure, it was a crisis of physics. The Soviet Union's air defense strategy was built on a simple, brutal equation. If it flies, we can see it. If we can see it, we can track it. If we can track it, we can kill it. This was the logic that had birthed the MiG-25, a monster of an aircraft built of steel and titanium, designed with one purpose, to fly high and fast enough to catch the SR-70. It was the logic that had created the S-300 missile system, a complex multi-layered web of radar and interceptors that could, in theory, stop a NATO nuclear blitz. This entire network, this continental-scale fortress of electronics, was now in question. If a single American aircraft could fly unseen, it did not matter if the Soviets had 10,000 interceptors. They would all be sitting on the ground, useless, as a ghost delivered a nuclear payload to the Kremlin. The stakes were not just about a tactical advantage. The stakes were everything. The Phantom threatened the very concept of mutually assured destruction. MAD only worked if both sides knew they could strike back. But what if one side could land a perfect, decapitating first strike, and the other side would only know it had happened when their command centers turned to glass? The report on the general's desk was no longer an engineering problem. It was a nightmare. It proved that the Americans, for all their decadence, were holding a new card. A card that the Soviets did not even know was in the deck. They had to find it. They had to know what it was, and they had to find a way to kill it. The hunt for the impossible had begun. The red folder on the PVO general's desk did not remain thin for long. It became a stack. The stack became a cabinet. And the cabinet became the physical manifestation of Soviet military paranoia. The scramble was immediate, and it was total. This was no longer a matter for low-level radar operators. This was a vopros gosudastvenoi vazhnosti, a question of state importance. It was escalated above the PVO, landing with a thud in the offices of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and, more ominously, the KGB. The 5th Directorate, responsible for rooting out ideological subversion, was brought in to investigate the operators. Men like Dmitry Ogarkov were pulled from their posts and subjected to extended interviews. Was it sabotage? Was it drunkenness? Was it a coordinated psychological attack by the West, designed to make loyal Soviet soldiers imagine ghosts? They found nothing. The men were loyal, they were sober, and their stories were identical. They were reporting what their instruments, their reliable, state-sanctioned instruments, were telling them. The problem was not the men. The problem was the sky. With human error and treason ruled out, the response became mechanical. The PVO High Command initiated Operation Cascade, a series of rolling, high-alert hunter-killer patrols along the entire western frontier. This wasn't a normal scramble. This was a blank check. The protocol was simple. The moment a phantom signal was detected by one station, it was cross-referenced with 2 others. If any 2 agreed, an entire zveno, a flight of 4, was launched. Not just any flight. These were the elite, the veterans of the 148th Combat Application Center. They were the best pilots in the Soviet Union, flying the best aircraft they had, the brand new MiG-29 and the still formidable MiG-25. The result was a colossal, expensive, and deeply humiliating failure. A cascade alert would sound at an airbase near Rostock. 4 MiG-29 seconds would burn a river of kerosene, thundering into the night sky. Their powerful slot-back radars would sweep the target coordinates. The pilots, their eyes straining in the red glow of their cockpits, would see nothing. Their radar screens were clean. Their infrared sensors were cold. Yet, on the ground, the P-18 radar operators were screaming that the MiGs were flying right through the target. One pilot, a decorated major named Ivan Grechko, reported the experience with chilling clarity. I was vectored to Sector 9. The GCI, ground control intercept, operator was insistent the target was 10 kilometers to my front. I engaged full afterburner. I scanned all frequencies. I could see the city lights of Berlin 80 kilometers away. I could see the stars. I saw no aircraft. I saw no heat plume. I saw no exhaust. I tell you, Comrade General, I was alone in that sky. He wasn't. The Phantom was there. It was just 10 kilometers to his front, watching him. The cost was astronomical. A MiG-25 burned fuel so fast, it was said it could take off, break a world record, and land from fuel starvation in under 30 minutes. These cascade missions were draining the strategic fuel reserves of entire air divisions. Engines were being worn out, airframes stressed, and pilots exhausted, all in a hunt for a glitch that was now appearing with mocking regularity. They fired missiles at empty air. They flew thousands of sorties. They found nothing. The Phantom became a legend, a bogeyman in the barracks and the briefing rooms. It acquired a name, the Nevidimka, the Invisible One. Pilots began to talk. They spoke of a feeling, a sensation of being watched just before an alert. Radar operators, their careers on the line, became obsessive, staring at their screens until their eyes bled, terrified of missing it, and even more terrified of seeing it. The paranoia reached the highest levels. At a secret meeting in a GRU facility outside Moscow, a panel of aerospace engineers was convened. They were shown the data, the radar cross-section, RCS, plots, the flicker patterns, the radar drinking anomalies. The chief engineer, a man who had helped design the S-300, reviewed the evidence, his face growing paler with each page. Finally, the presiding general slammed his fist on the table. "Well, what is it? What have the Americans done?" The engineer, a man named Turgenev, took a slow breath. "Comrade General, what you are describing. It does not obey the laws of physics as we know them. Do not give me excuses, Turgenev. Give me answers." "The data is contradictory," Turgenev said, his voice shaking slightly. "The object is sometimes detected at high altitude, moving slowly, slower than a B-52. This suggests a large, low-speed aircraft, but then it disappears from a P-18, which should be impossible for a large target. The VHF waves of the spoon rest are meters long. They should reflect off any large metal object. This smear on the screen. It's as if the object is absorbing the energy. Absorbing how? That is the problem. To absorb that much VHF energy, it would have to be enormous. A flying mountain. Or it would have to be coated in a material we have not yet dreamed of. Or it is not metal." A KGB representative in the corner, a man who had said nothing, finally spoke. "It is a provocation, designed to make us bankrupt ourselves. It is not an aircraft." "Then what is it, Colonel?" the general shot back. "A projection? A new form of electronic warfare?" This became the first, most comforting theory. Advanced electronic warfare. The Americans were not flying an aircraft. They were using a powerful, space-based or ground-based emitter to project a phantom signal onto Soviet radar. This EW would spoof the P-18, then turn off when the MiG 29 seconds got close, making their own higher-frequency radars see nothing. This theory was popular because it was not terrifying. It meant Soviet defenses were sound. They just needed a new filter. But the theory had a fatal flaw. The phantoms were not random. They appeared over high-value targets. They skirted the edges of the most sensitive air defense batteries, as if they were mapping them. This wasn't a passive projection. This was reconnaissance. This led to the second theory, a high-speed drone. The Americans were masters of this, from the U-2 to the SR-71. Perhaps this was the long-rumored D-21 successor, a Mach 5 unmanned craft. But again, the data refused to cooperate. The Nevidimka was often slow. It lingered. It was not a dash craft. Then the theories grew darker, more desperate. The engineers at the Sukhoi and Mikoyan design bureaus, when pushed, offered a third possibility, a plasma weapon. They theorized the Americans had somehow weaponized plasma, creating a bubble of ionized gas around a conventional aircraft. This plasma field, in theory, could absorb or deflect radar waves, rendering the plane invisible. This theory was terrifying because it meant the Americans were a generation ahead in fundamental physics. The final theory was the most fantastic, and the one closest to the truth. An old engineer, a man who had worked on Tupolev's projects in the 1950s, quietly suggested it. "What if it is a Letayushchai Krylo, a flying wing?" He was almost laughed out of the room. The concept was a joke, a relic. The Soviets and the Americans had both experimented with flying wings in the 1940s and 50s. They were hopelessly unstable. They required constant, minute adjustments that were beyond the capability of a human pilot or the analog computers of the day. The design was a dead end, a footnote in aviation history. "It is not possible," the chief engineer Turgenev declared. "To make such a design stable, you would need a computer that could think faster than a pilot. A digital fly-by-wire system more advanced than anything we have. It is science fiction." And so, the truth was dismissed as fantasy. The Soviets were left with their ghosts. They were stuck in a loop of paranoia, launching billions of rubles of equipment into the sky to chase shadows, while the real phantom sat just outside the range of their comprehension, a dark, impossible shape, gliding with impunity through the very heart of their empire. The investigation had failed. The hunt had yielded nothing but fear. And the Nevidimka, the invisible one, continued its silent, mocking patrol. While the Soviet High Command bankrupted its air divisions hunting the Nevidimka, while generals and engineers tore their hair out, convinced they were facing science fiction, they were right. The science fiction was just happening in a different place. It was happening in the one place on Earth more secret than any Soviet NIU or research institute. It was happening in the California desert. Our story, the American side of this mystery, does not begin in the 1980s. It begins decades earlier, in the blood-soaked skies over Vietnam. The 1960s had been a brutal education for the United States Air Force. The paradigm of the 1950s, fly higher and faster than the enemy, had been shattered. It was shattered by a crude, cheap telephone pole of a weapon, the Soviet S-75 Divina missile, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline. This simple radar-guided missile had brought down Gary Power's U-2 inches 1960. Over Hanoi, it had reaped a grim harvest of F-4 Phantoms and B-52 seconds. The Americans responded with their own high-tech for the time electronic warfare, the Wild Weasel platforms designed to hunt the radar sites. It was a vicious, bloody game of cat and mouse. But for every radar they jammed, the Soviets and their Vietnamese allies simply adapted. They would turn their radar on for 3 seconds, just long enough to get a lock and fire. By the early 1970s, the Pentagon was facing a terrifying mathematical reality. The Soviet-style Integrated Air Defense System, IADS, was growing exponentially. It was a dense, overlapping, multi-layered web of search radars, tracking radars, missiles and interceptor aircraft, all networked together. Against this, speed was no longer a defense. Even the SR-71, the fastest thing ever built, was vulnerable during its development. And the B-52, the backbone of the nuclear bomber force, was a flying school bus in comparison. It would be massacred. In 1974, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, posed a simple, world-changing question. They asked, what if we are asking the wrong question? What if the answer isn't how to fly faster, but how to fly unseen? This was not a new idea. Engineers had known for decades that certain shapes and certain radar-absorbent materials could reduce a plane's signature, but it was always a trade-off. A stealthy shape was, by its very nature, an unstable shape. It couldn't fly. The problem landed on the desks of two legendary rival-like workshops. The first was Northrop, whose eccentric genius, Jack Northrop, had been obsessed with flying wings since the 1930s. The second was a top-secret division of Lockheed, a place so secret it was barely a rumor. It was run by Ben Rich, the protege of the legendary Kelly Johnson. This was the Skunk Works, the team that had already built the impossible with the U-2 and the SR-71. Lockheed's Skunk Works took the problem to a theoretical physicist, Denis Overholzer. He and his team, working with an obscure paper written by a Soviet physicist named Pyotr Ufimtsev in an act of supreme irony, had a breakthrough. Ufimtsev's equations suggested that the strength of a radar return was not related to the size of an object, but to the shape and angle of its edges. This was the Rosetta Stone. The Skunk Works team realized they could build a plane without curves. They could build it out of flat panels or facets like a diamond. If they angled these facets just right, none of them would ever reflect a radar beam back to its source. The beams would be scattered, like sunlight off a disco ball, lost in the noise of the surrounding sky. In 1977, in a classified sand-blasted corner of Area 51, a program codenamed Have Blue took to the sky. It was hideous. It looked like a triangle of black glass, a broken shard of obsidian. It was so unstable that a human being could not fly it. It flew only because of a revolutionary new system, a triple-redundant digital fly-by-wire computer which made thousands of micro-adjustments every second, far faster than any human brain, just to keep the aircraft from tearing itself apart. This was the machine that would become the Phone 117 Ampere's Nighthawk. This was the ghost that Dmitry Ogakov saw on his screen in 1984. It was not a plasma weapon. It was not electronic warfare. It was an impossible shape, piloted by a computer, coated in radar, absorbent paint, gliding silently through the gaps in their defenses. It was the Scalpel, the tactical first kick-in-the-door weapon. It was built to hunt the S-300 batteries, the command bunkers, the high-value targets. And the Soviets never guessed it existed. Not really. But as the Skunk Works was busy building their faceted diamond, the United States Air Force had a bigger problem. The F-117 was a strike fighter. It could not win the Cold War. The real war, if it ever came, would be strategic. It would be about destroying the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, a vast continent-spanning network of missile silos, submarine pens, and, most terrifyingly, the new mobile RT-23 and RT-2PM Topol ICBMs. These were missiles on trucks, hidden in the vast, frozen forests of Siberia. The F-117 could not hunt those. It didn't have the range. The B-52, which had the range, would be detected the second it crossed the border. The Air Force needed something else. They needed the Advanced Technology Bomber, or ATB. This time, the challenge went to Northrop, and they returned to Jack Northrop's old, failed dream, the flying wing, the joke that the Soviet engineers had dismissed. The Northrop team, led by designer John Cashin and a quiet genius named Irv Walland, realized what the Soviets had not. The fly-by-wire computers that made the F-117 possible also solved the flying wing's instability. The science fiction computer was real, and the flying wing, it turned out, was the perfect shape for stealth. The F-117, with its flat panels, was a first-generation solution. It was a low observable aircraft. The Northrop team wanted true invisibility. A flying wing had no tail. It had no vertical stabilizers. It had no fuselage in the traditional sense. It was just one single continuous curvature shape. Where the F-117 deflected radar, this new design would absorb it. Its skin would be a classified sandwich of carbon fiber composites and radar-absorbent materials. Its engines would be buried deep inside the wing, their hot exhaust mixed with cold air, and vented out over the top, making them invisible to infrared sensors. It was a shape that seemed to come from another star system, a vast, black, seamless boomerang. It was designed to fly 6,000 miles, penetrate the most advanced air defenses on Earth without ever being detected, and destroy 16 separate, hardened targets with nuclear precision. This was Project Aurora, or Senior Citizen. The program was so black, so secret, that its funding was hidden in carve-outs from other military budgets. Its workers, sworn to secrecy, lived and worked at a remote facility in Palmdale, California, known only as Site 42. While the Soviets were chasing the F-117 ghosts over East Germany, a different, far more terrible ghost was being assembled in the desert. This was not a scalpel. This was the Mjolnir, the hammer of God. And as the 1980s came to a close, the Soviets still had no idea. They had spent a decade and a fortune preparing to fight the F-117, and they didn't even know that existed. They were utterly, completely, and terrifyingly blind to the B-2 Spirit, the single most expensive and most revolutionary aircraft ever built. The true, invisible one. The Soviet Union never had a single confrontation with the Nevedimka in the way their pilots had dreamed of a glorious, swirling dogfight where a lucky shot would bring the ghost tumbling to Earth. They never caught it. They never even saw it. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not a battle. It was a press conference. The date was November 22nd, 1988. At Air Force Plant 42 inches Palmdale, California, the very Site 42, where the B-2 had been assembled in perfect secrecy, the United States Air Force was rolling out its new strategic bomber. The event was a carefully staged piece of political theater, a final, thunderous statement of technological dominance in the dying years of the Cold War. In a GRU listening post in Cuba, an analyst named Captain Andrei Volkov was monitoring the live, encrypted satellite feed. He was an intelligence officer, not an engineer, but he knew what he was supposed to be looking at. The Americans were unveiling the ATB, the Advanced Technology Bomber. His superiors in Moscow had assured him, based on the best analysis from their best institutes, that this would be a modest evolution. Perhaps a new engine for the B-1 or a faster, higher-flying version. The hangar doors slid open. A military band played. Then the thing was towed onto the tarmac. Andrei Volkov stopped breathing. He stared at the grainy black and white feed. He adjusted the tracking, thinking the image was distorted, that the satellite was failing, but the image remained stable. It had no tail. It had no body. It was a wing. A vast, black, seamless, impossible shape. It looked less like an airplane and more like a shadow that had been peeled off the floor of hell. It was the science fiction joke. It was the dead-end design. It was the Letayushchai Krylo, the flying wing that Turgenev and the other engineers had dismissed as an impossibility, a fantasy. And it was sitting on a tarmac in California. This was the shock moment. Not a flicker on a radar screen, not a pilot's panicked report, but the cold, undeniable, Public admission that the Americans had not just broken the rules of physics, they had written an entirely new book. For Volkov, and for the high command in Moscow who would see his report, the pieces suddenly, horrifyingly, fell into place. The Nevidimka, the ghost that had plagued them over East Germany, the glitches and phantoms that had cost them billions of rubles. That wasn't this. This B-2, was a strategic bomber. It was designed to fly to Moscow to hunt mobile ICBMs in Siberia. It was the hammer, the horrifying realization, the true shock that broke their ideological foundations was this. If the Americans were showing them this, the strategic weapon, what had they not been showing them? They realized the ghost they had been hunting for a decade was an entirely different aircraft, a smaller tactical version, a scalpel. The phantom on Dmitry Ogarkov's screen was real. It had a name, the F-117, and the Americans had already used it. They had been flying it, undetected, over the most sensitive territory on Earth for years. And the Soviets had been too arrogant, too hidebound, to believe their own instruments. They realized their investigation had been a complete, systemic failure. They had been chasing the wrong theories, dismissing the correct one as a joke. They realized that while they were spending a fortune on Operation Cascade, the Americans had two separate operational stealth programs. The B-2 was not just an aircraft. It was a message. It was the Americans looking the Soviet Union in the eye and saying, everything you have built, your entire 5 million-man army, your 50,000 tank armada, your 30,000 missile air defense network, it is all useless. It was an admission of checkmate. The Soviet response was one of pure animal panic. The military-industrial complex went into a terminal spasm. Orders were screamed from Moscow. Forget the plasma weapons. Forget the EW theories. The flying wing is real. Counter it. Engineers at Mikoyan and Sukhoi were pulled from their existing projects and given a simple, impossible task: build one. This was the birth of the MiG-1.44 and the Sukhoi S-37, later Su-47, Berkut. They were frantic, desperate attempts to leapfrog a generation of technology, to build a fifth-generation fighter now. But you cannot build a stealth fighter when your best computers are still running on vacuum tubes. The Berkut, with its exotic forward-swept wings, was a marvel of aerodynamics, but it was a dinosaur in terms of stealth. It would light up a radar screen like a Christmas tree. The PVO, the now humiliated Air Defense Force, scrambled to find a silver bullet. They poured their last remaining rubles into a single, desperate hope: VHF radar. They reasoned correctly that the F-117 and B-2 were optimized to defeat high-frequency radar, the kind used for fire control and missile guidance. But their old, crude P-18 spoon-rest radar Dmitry Ogarkov's station used low-frequency VHF waves. These waves were meters long. They were, in theory, so long that they could wrap around a stealth aircraft, creating a resonance that would reveal something. It was a return to 1950s technology. They began a crash program to link these ancient radars together with new digital processors, creating a network that could, maybe, get a flicker. They were trying to build a continental-scale defense out of a single, obscure physics loophole. It was all useless. It was a futile gesture. The Soviet economy was a hollowed-out gourd. The state was collapsing. The Berlin Wall was about to fall. The Americans had not just built a ghost. They had built a weapon so advanced, so expensive, and so reality-bending that it had, in effect, bankrupted the enemy's entire belief system. The Nevidimka had won the war without ever firing a shot. The true killer statistic that finalized the B-2's victory did not come from a spreadsheet. It came just 3 years after its unveiling, not from a test range, but from the skies over a burning city. The date was January 17th, 1991. The city was Baghdad. Operation Desert Storm. On that first night, 30 417 Ampere's Nighthawks, the original Nevidimka that had plagued Dmitry Ogarkov, were the first in. They took off from a base in Saudi Arabia, and as they approached the Iraqi border, they did not climb, they did not jam, they did not accelerate, they just were. On the ground, Iraqi air defense operators, trained by Soviet advisors and using top-of-the-line Soviet radar systems, sat at their screens. They were at the center of the most densely defended airspace on Earth, a network of thousands of SA-2, SA-3 and SA-6 missiles and countless anti-aircraft guns. They were ready. They were waiting, and they saw nothing. Their screens, like Dimitri's, showed only static. They listened for the roar of engines and heard only the desert wind. Then, at 2:51 a.m., downtown Baghdad erupted. The first bomb of the air war, a GBU-27 Paveway 3 laser-guided bunker buster, dropped from the invisible F-117 of Major Greg Feast, sliced through the concrete roof of the AT&T building, the central telecommunications hub that linked Saddam Hussein's entire air defense network. In a single, silent, unseen flash, the brain of the Iraqi IADs was destroyed. Before the main air campaign had even begun, before the first cruise missile had arrived, before a single B-52 had appeared on radar, the war for the sky was over. The phone 117 seconds had decapitated the entire system before its operators even knew to press the alert button. This was the verdict. Over the next 43 days, the statistics became a eulogy for the entire Soviet doctrine of air defense. Phone 117 seconds flew just over 1,300 sorties, less than 2% of the total Allied air campaign. They struck more than 40% of the strategic targets. They were the only aircraft to strike targets in downtown Baghdad. Over 1,600 missiles were fired blindly into the night sky by the terrified, confused Iraqi defenders. And the final, definitive killer statistic, the number that was whispered in horror in the briefing rooms of the dying PVO back in Moscow: 0. 0 phone 117 seconds were shot down. 0 were hit. 0 were even tracked. The ghost that the Soviets had dismissed as a glitch had just by itself dismantled an entire army built on their technology and their tactics. And as they watched this slaughter, the generals in Moscow knew. They knew that the F-117 was the scalpel. And they knew with existential dread that back in America, the Hammer, the B-2 Spirit, was just now entering full production. The Nevedimka they had seen was this deadly. What about the one they hadn't? This is where the story of a single, mysterious aircraft becomes the story of why an empire collapsed. The B-2 Spirit and its smaller F-117 cousin were not just weapons. They were the physical manifestation of a fundamental systemic gap. The Cold War was not, in the end, won by the side with the most tanks or the most missiles. The Soviets had more of both. It was won by the side that could innovate. The Soviet system was a marvel of imitation. It was built on a foundation of industrial espionage. They stole the American B-29 bomber and reverse-engineered it, bolt for bolt, to create their Tu-4. They stole nuclear secrets. Their entire military-industrial complex was designed to copy, refine, and build at scale. It was a brute force approach. If the Americans built a fast jet, the F-4, the Soviets would build a faster one, the MiG-25. If the Americans built a big bomb, the Soviets would build the Tsar bomber. But stealth was different. You could not steal stealth. Stealth was not a piece of metal. It was a theory. It was a confluence of 3 revolutionary ideas, none of which the Soviet system was capable of producing. First, it required material science that was a generation ahead. The skin of the B-2 was not just paint, it was a classified, multi-layered composite, a sandwich of carbon fiber and radar-absorbent polymers that was more secret than the aircraft's shape. It was a chemical formula, a manufacturing process so precise and so toxic that its workers had to be in specialized suits. You could not copy this by looking at a photograph. Second, it required physics that you were willing to believe. The Soviet engineer Pyotr Ufimtsev had written the core equations, but his own government had ignored them. They were science fiction. The Americans, at the Skunk Works, had read his impossible paper and believed it. They had bet an entire black budget on a fantasy. Third, and most decisively, it required computation. The B-2 and F-117 are inherently unstable. They are designed to be. They fly only because a digital fly-by-wire system, a bank of redundant computers, makes thousands of micro-adjustments every second to keep them from tumbling out of the sky. This was the American ace, the microchip. The Soviet Union had deliberately, ideologically stifled the development of personal computers. To the KGB, a network of small, powerful computers was a threat, a tool for samizdat, for sharing information. They had focused instead on massive, centralized mainframes. As a result, when the American engineers at Lockheed and Northrop needed a computer small and fast enough to fly an impossible shape, they had it. When the Soviet engineers at Sukhoi were told to build a counter, they were still designing on slide rules. The B-2 was not just an aircraft, it was a $2 billion, 500-ton flying supercomputer. The shock of 1988 was the realization that the Americans were not just playing on a different field, they were playing a different game. The Soviets were playing chess, a game of brute force and known moves. The Americans were playing a game of their own invention, a game where the pieces could turn invisible. The desperate, panicked Berkut and 1.44 programs were the last gasps of a dying system, a system built on imitation, trying to copy a concept it could no longer even afford to imagine. The B-2 was the final killer statistic. It proved that one side could spend its treasure on an idea, and the other could only spend itself into oblivion chasing its shadow. The mystery of the Nevidimka began in the 1980s, a flicker on a green screen in a dark forest. It was a ghost story that the Soviet High Command told itself, a mystery they tried to solve with brute force, with interceptors, and with paranoia. But they were wrong. It was not a mystery, it was a verdict. It was the verdict on an economic system that had chosen imitation over innovation. It was the verdict on a political system that had chosen ideological purity over physical reality, dismissing the flying wing as a fantasy because it was safer than being wrong. It was the verdict on a military that had built a shield of 10,000 missiles, only to find that a new idea had rendered it all junk. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, 1 year after the B-2 was revealed. The Soviet Union itself, hollowed out, bankrupt, and technologically checkmated, ceased to exist in 1991, the same year the F-117 proved the ghost was real. The B-2 spirit, the true invisible one, was the shadow that hung over the Cold War's end. It was the ultimate expression of American dominance. Not just the power to destroy an enemy, but the power to do it unseen. The power to make an entire empire question its own senses, and to realize in its final, agonizing moments that it had been hunting ghosts, while the real, impossible shape was already overhead, silent and waiting.